History teaches us that the Reich fell, that its leaders died in bunkers, that its ideology was crushed beneath the boots of liberation. But history is wrong. The Reich did not fall. It converted, from empire to architecture, from uniform to asset, from ideology to inheritance. It buried itself in vaults, in names erased from record, in doctrines refined behind closed doors. And from this silence, it rebuilt, not in public but in private influence, not in flags but in systems, not to conquer nations but to own them. At the center of this rebirth was not a general or a statesman but a doctor. Sigmund Rascher understood what the others did not, that the future would not be won through battlefields but through biological succession, controlled economies, and invisible power. In 1944, as the world braced for the final assault on Nazi Germany, Rascher and his allies launched something far more enduring and far more insidious than a last defense. They launched an ark, filled not with animals, but with ideological code, a new doctrine, a bloodline. They called their vessel the Illuminati. Not the parody, not the internet fiction. The true Illuminati, a reforged lineage of command seeded in the shadows, cloaked in 1,000 false mirrors. While the world laughed at pyramids and dollar bills, the real architects moved gold, erased identities, and raised a generation to inherit the world, not through democracy or revolution, but through controlled collapse. Their method is elegant: push nations toward autocracy, let wealth replace law, let states be hollowed out until only strongmen and syndicates remain. Systems where a small group can rule everything. Their targets? The same as ever: America, Russia, and China. And when these pillars are aligned, when they stand together under a single global logic of oligarchy, the ark will open, and what was once hidden will become inevitable. What follows is not legend. It is the opening chapter of a plan still in motion. The story of how a doctrine was not defeated but reborn, twisted into a form that threatens all humanity. The war was still being fought, but the Reich had already begun to vanish. Not in flames, not yet, but into crates, manifests, and quiet vaults scattered across a continent under siege. Even as tanks pressed east and bombers fell from the sky, a quieter front opened in the drawing rooms of Paris, the museums of Warsaw, and the cellars of Vienna. Priceless paintings were lifted from their walls with white-gloved hands. Gold was weighed, catalogued, crated. Manuscripts, ancient icons, Fabergé eggs, items of beauty and power, vanished into the fog of war under the guise of protection. This wasn't chaos. This was systematic looting, orchestrated with bureaucratic obsession. Nazi officials oversaw vast networks of seizure squads. Einsatzstab, Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the Devisenschutz SS units specializing in financial crimes. Each stolen artifact was meticulously logged. On paper, the operation resembled legitimate state seizure. In practice, it was one of history's most methodical thefts. The documentation, far from revealing the truth, was a trap, a trail of deliberate misleads, false audits, and mirrored inventories. For every crate recovered later by Allied investigators, another, far more valuable, had already disappeared behind layers of disinformation. And where did it all go? Into the smoke and silence of secret relocation. By 1943, the inner circle of Nazi leadership had already accepted what they could never publicly admit: the Reich would fall. But ideology, capital, and personnel could be preserved, so long as they moved fast and moved well. Submarines slipped out from coastal bunkers under diplomatic cover. Couriers vanished into neutral territory, with bearer bonds sewn into their coats. Swiss vaults, Spanish safe houses, Argentinian bank accounts, all became staging grounds for the quiet continuity of a collapsing empire. This was not retreat, it was redirection. To make it work, they needed more than secrecy. They needed chaos, and so they created it. Orders from high command became cryptic, conflicting. Logistics collapsed by design. Records were lost, edited, or conveniently misplaced. Public disputes between military and SS officials were exaggerated or staged entirely, giving the Allies every reason to believe the Reich was tearing itself apart. It was a theatre of confusion, masking the final act of strategic extraction. What appeared to be the death throes of fascism were, in truth, a carefully orchestrated disappearing act. and the audience, exhausted by war, was all too ready to believe it. By the time Berlin burned, the vaults were already sealed. The Allies would find ruins, corpses, and empty archives, but not the men, nor the gold, nor the secrets that mattered. The official story would read as collapse, a mad regime devouring itself in its final hours. But behind the smoke and the broken glass, a different story continued in motion, precise, hidden, intact. It had begun as looting, it ended as exfiltration. The Reich, in its final performance, mastered the one trick the world didn't expect: how to vanish and survive. By 1943, the Reich had begun to cannibalize its own myths. The tidy hierarchies of race, the blonde gods and brown-eyed subhumans, no longer explained the chaos unspooling on every front. The old doctrines had served well in posters and speeches, but in the laboratories of Dachau and the archives of the Ahnenerbe, another truth had begun to whisper itself into existence. Dr. Sigmund Rasche, physician and occult researcher, was not a man given to whispers. Backed by Himmler and operating at the core of SS medical experimentation, Rasche held a rare position-scientific license without moral restraint. But even within that shadowed privilege, his work began to drift beyond the party's public orthodoxy. What Rasche discovered, or claimed to, would never make its way into Nazi broadcasts. The problem, as Rasche saw it, wasn't that the Aryan race was failing. The problem was that it had already failed. Within the troves of ethnographic data compiled by the Ahnenerbe, ritual texts, crania, mitochondrial samples, Rasche began to trace a lineage backwards into prehistory, into myth, and what he found unsettled him. The markers the Nazis claimed as Aryan appeared not in the Germanic bloodlines, but with surprising frequency among the very population the Reich had marked for extinction: the Jews. To the regime, this was heresy. To Rasche, it was revelation. He posited a radical reinterpretation. The Jewish people were not a corrupting race, but the corrupted remnants of an ancient superior lineage, one that had dispersed, diluted, and degraded over centuries of exile and assimilation. They were the shadow of something once great, but not beyond recovery. What the Reich needed, Rasche argued, was not racial purity, but genetic reclamation. The ancestral flame could still be reignited if one knew where to find the embers. So Rasche began to search. Using blood records, biometric archives, and prisoner experimentation, he refined a matrix of traits: neurological resilience under hypoxia, high-pressure endurance, extreme stress tolerance, and rare combinations of cranial and epigenetic markers. He cross-referenced these with behavioral profiles: leadership capacity, resistance to interrogation, linguistic adaptability. From tens of thousands, he identified 12. They were children. Some came from the camps, others from ghettos or transit convoys diverted at the last minute. None were more than 9 years old. All of them, by any Nazi standard, were Jewish. But Rasche saw something different. Not victims, not exceptions, keys. With his wife, Nini Deal, Rasche took them into private custody. The outside world was told they had died in experimentation. In reality, they were moved to a secured estate where they were fed, trained, and indoctrinated, not as Jews, not even as Germans, but as something new, something destined. They were told they were chosen and not metaphorically. Rasche used the word like scripture. You have been selected by blood, not the blood of your people, but the blood beneath that blood, the old blood, the true blood. He taught them that the world had forgotten its origins, that weakness had crept into the veins of civilization, and that their suffering had been a trial, a crucible to restore what had been lost. These children were not meant to survive the Reich. They were meant to replace it. They learned languages, strategy, war. They were shown maps and taught to view borders as temporary. Their education combined classical training with esoteric rites culled from Ahnenerbe archives, Nordic runes alongside Hebrew liturgy, taught not as opposition but as refractions of the same ancient light. They were to carry forward not just Nazi ideology, but its reformation, a secret order born from its contradictions. They met at Wewelsburg, naturally, not Berlin, not Munich, but the fortress rebuilt as a sacred heart of the SS, its black stone halls etched with runes and visions of empire. The rain followed Rasche there, a soft, persistent patter as he arrived under escort, passing beneath the watchful gaze of the black sun mosaic beneath the tower's floor. The guards didn't speak. No one did. It wasn't necessary. Inside, Himmler waited, seated alone at a long table beneath a chandelier of unlit torches. Before him lay a file, Rascher's proposal, already read, already approved by the Führer, but still unopened in Himmler's hand, as if unread. Rascher entered with perfect posture. His nerves were quiet, but his breath betrayed him. Himmler didn't look up. "You've come to beg," he said softly. Rascher didn't flinch. "I've come to complete the transfer." A long silence. Himmler opened the file with gloved fingers, purely for the theatre of it. "I presume you understand your situation," Himmler said, eyes still on the pages. "By the end of this year, Berlin will likely fall. Our cities will burn. You will not be safe." "I anticipated this," Rascher replied. "That's why the operation is already in motion. I've arranged transport, submarine passage through Bergen, my wife, the children, and myself. New identities, all records destroyed, replaced by the scandal I've staged." Himmler's brow lifted slightly. "Scandal?" "A fall from grace," Rascher said, with something almost like pride. "I've written the letters myself, created testimony, falsified internal reports, claims of medical misconduct, false pregnancies by Nini, will be disgraced, arrested, purged, and forgotten. Exactly. The world will believe we died in shame. No tribunal will search for us. No historian will name us." Himmler looked at him finally. "A brilliant lie, Doctor. You always did understand how to hide behind your own blood." "Now," Himmler said, "tell me the part no one else knows, the children." Rascher stepped forward, his voice calm. "They are the doctrine. Everything else is noise." He placed a folder on the table, filled with biometric data, gene maps, pressure endurance charts. "I began with Ahnenerbe records, patterns, phenotypes, behavioral traits under duress. And what I found, repeatedly overwhelmingly, was that the qualities we attributed to Aryan purity do not exist in Aryans." He paused. "Let the weight hang. They exist, Reichsführer, in the Ashkenazi." Himmler said nothing, but the faintest twitch pulled at his eye. "They are the remnant of the source, the lost tribe, the corrupted strain, the traits we sought to cultivate, resilience, neural efficiency, cold adaptability. They remain, buried, in the very people we tried to erase. I have not purified the doctrine. I have corrected it." "And these children?" Himmler asked. 12, all selected from Jewish stock, but filtered through genetic criteria. They are not Jews. They are the seed of what was lost. I have reclaimed the lineage. They are chosen." "Chosen?" Himmler's voice sharpened slightly. "Yes," Rascher said. "You of all people understand. The arc was never about race. It was about inheritance." Rascher stepped back from the diagram of layered circles. 12 nodes at the center, a spiral of outer rings extending outward like ripples on black water. "We will call it the Illuminati," he said. Himmler looked up. His eyes didn't narrow in doubt, only in calculation. "A provocative choice," he said. "The name still circulates in certain esoteric circles, Masonic histories, Theosophist salons, France, England, even in America." "Exactly," Rascher replied. "It lives, barely, just enough to be useful." Himmler crossed the room slowly, hands behind his back. "You believe the name will protect the organization?" "No," Rascher said. "I believe the name will discredit the truth." He gestured to the outer rings of the diagram. "Once we establish the inner structure, we begin a parallel effort. False lodges, false sightings, false doctrines. We let the idea spread, just enough. Wild claims, secret handshakes, inverted pyramids on the dollar bill. Give the world 1,000 versions of the Illuminati, all of them wrong, all of them laughable." Himmler's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Conspiracies as camouflage." "Exactly," Rascher said. "We will teach the world to dismiss the name on contact. So when someone stumbles near the truth, they will be ignored, mocked, forgotten." He leaned in slightly, voice low and sharp. "We will not hide the arc, Herr Reichsführer. We will let it drift in full view, painted in the colors of madness." Himmler tapped one of the diagram's outer circles with a gloved finger. "And those in these outer rings, what do they believe? That they are serving power," Rascher said. "That they're part of something ancient. They'll swear oaths," quote Voltaire, "talk of Luciferian wisdom and world councils, but they'll never reach the core. They'll never know the doctrine. Himmler straightened. Good! Let the fools cloak the fire. And with that, he turned away, already imagining how the legend would spread, like smoke. Pawns, Himmler said. Pieces. Willing, hungry, useful. The majority will never glimpse the center. That is how the ark floats, invisible, protected by its own illusions. Lineage, myth, and control, reunified through force. The doctrine, Himmler said, tapping 2 fingers on the closed dossier, is now yours to define. Not for me, for the future. Rascher nodded once, then let me say it clearly. He opened a second folder, fewer pages, denser markings. The notes weren't scientific, they were structural. We were wrong, he began, not in believing we were chosen, but in believing we were alone. The ancestral line we claimed ran through the Aryans is a broken half. The other half passed down through the Ashkenazi. Somehow, over centuries, the true lineage divided. They kept the genetic fire. We kept the will to power. So you believe, Himmler said slowly, that this rift can be repaired? No, Rascher corrected. It can be reclaimed. He leaned in, cold fire in his voice. Their blood is superior, not spiritually, biologically. That's what we never understood. We burned them by the millions, while their children carried the traits we needed. So I have taken what was useful, purged what was not. That is our right. That is our duty. This is not betrayal of the Reich. It is its refinement. Himmler did not blink. You believe the enemy carries our future. I believe we were 2 branches of the same tree, Rascher said. We are cutting off theirs to graft it back into ours. He smiled faintly. The doctrine is not symbolic. It is sovereign. We are building a bloodline. The children are its founding line. Their genes, combined with our discipline, our vision, our power, will birth a world that bends. And the Ark? Himmler asked. Built to preserve that line, Rascher said. It is not a metaphor. It is a breeding program with teeth. The room felt colder now, as if the bloodless clarity of Rascher's words had stripped away even the storm outside. Himmler stood slowly, not in rebuke, not in shock, but in recognition. There was no doubt in his eyes, no warning, only a kind of grim reverence. The Führer has already approved the operation, he said, but his approval is irrelevant. History will not be written by charismatics or generals. It will be written by the bloodlines we protect now. He crossed the room, stood before Rascher. I have cleared the records. The arrests will proceed in 2 days. Your disgrace will be absolute. The last witnesses will be silenced. Your children's identities scrubbed. The scandal you created is complete. He leaned close. And I will make certain no rival doctrine survives. Steiner's neuroeugenics dead. Von List's esoteric cults dismantled. Anyone who stands between your children and the throne we are building will not see 1945. Rascher nodded. They will not be ready for decades, but when they come of age, they will inherit a world of useful fools and loyal corpses, Himmler said. That is our gift to them. Neither man smiled. This wasn't fantasy. It was logistics. Himmler returned to the dossier, placed his hand on its cover, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, go. No blessing, no oath. Just an execution order for history. By the spring of 1944, the Reich had begun its final performance. To the outside world, the Empire looked frayed to the point of disintegration. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat across the Eastern Front. Allied bombers darkened the skies over Hamburg and Cologne. Hitler was rarely seen, and when he was, he trembled. In Berlin, ration lines stretched around corners. In Paris, the Gestapo burned files by the truckload. And yet, even as the world prepared for Nazi Germany's funeral, inside the Reich's highest circles, a different tone had taken root. It was not panic. It was calculation. Himmler, Bormann, Rascher, they no longer spoke of victory. That fantasy had expired. What mattered now was what would survive. The project that had begun with tanks and flags would continue through vaults, archives, and bloodlines. Military command had become irrelevant. Control had shifted to the bureaucrats, financiers, and ideologues, those who could disappear into paper, rewrite identity, and own the future through a mission. They did not need to fake the deaths of everyone, only a select few. Most of the fleeing officers, scientists, and SS veterans would vanish without a trace, helped along by priests, bankers, and diplomats. No files needed to be altered. The chaos of war would erase them for free. But for the elite, for the architects of the new order, they required something more exacting. They needed the record to speak for them, not just to cover their tracks, but to create a counter-history, one the Allies would follow like breadcrumbs, never realizing it had been laid out for them in advance. It began with arrests that never happened. High-level names were placed on blacklists, then quietly removed, replaced by falsified reports of investigation, trial, punishment. Rasher himself became the prototype: falsified pregnancy experiments, anonymous denunciations, a fabricated arrest, a falsified execution. The documents were perfect, stamped with SS seals, signed by known officials, many of them dead, their pens now instruments of retroactive illusion. Witness statements were planted in local precincts, personal effects were recovered, cremation certificates were issued, but there was no body. There never would be. This was not deception in the usual sense. This was authorship. The Nazi record system, built with brutal precision during its rise, had become the final instrument of statecraft in its fall. Himmler once told a subordinate, "Reality is what the record says it is. The future will believe whatever is well documented." And so they documented everything perfectly, falsely, intentionally. The Reich was dying on the surface, but the file system remained alive. Names like Mengele, Kammler, Eichmann, Müller, Bormann, men who should have been tried or hanged, vanished into blind spots left deliberately intact. Some files were altered, others were left precisely as they were. The gaps themselves were designed. The illusion of completeness made the archive feel trustworthy. So much so that post-war investigators never thought to question the reality it described. And while the world processed a story of total collapse, the most dangerous parts of the regime were quietly transferred into banks, corporations, shipping lines, pharmaceutical firms, private estates. The Reich was not preserved, it was converted. It began like any other arrest. April 7th, 1944. A quiet morning in Munich, cold and damp. The war had not yet reached the city in bombs, but it hung in the air, on the radios, in the bread lines, in the eyes of people who no longer asked questions. At precisely 8:12, 3 SS vehicles pulled up in front of Rasher's townhouse. Black uniformed officers moved with grim precision. No shouting, no guns raised, just orders delivered and followed. Neighbours watched from their windows as Sigmund Rascher was led out in handcuffs, flanked by officers. His wife, Nini, stood in the doorway, silent. She wept, exactly as rehearsed. Someone across the street whispered, "It's the experiments, the pregnancies." Someone else muttered, "He's finished." The car doors closed. The convoy drove away. The street returned to silence. Within 72 hours, the files were complete, typed in triplicate, stamped with SS seals, signed by 2 Waffen officers and a senior medical registrar at Dachau. The documentation detailed Rascher's interrogation, his swift court-martial, and his execution by firing squad for treason and medical fraud. Attached were witness statements, a cremation order, and a transport ledger showing his final journey into the camp. Everything looked authentic, because it was, at the surface level. There was no need to forge the paper. The system itself was the forger. The Reich's bureaucracy was built not to reflect truth, but to replace it. By the time Allied forces reached Munich a year later, the file was waiting for them in the archive. Photographs, serial numbers, official reports. There was nothing to question. Rascher was dead. The matter was closed. But Rascher was not dead. While Munich watched his disgrace and the archive recorded his execution, the real Sigmund Rascher was already gone, slipping through the underbelly of Germany's secret war logistics, into the bloodstream of the Reich's disappearing elite. His route had been arranged months earlier: forged documents, safe houses along the Rhine, transport from a disguised Red Cross medical vehicle to a sealed freight container bound for Kiel. From there, he and Nini were transferred, under cover of night, to the Baltic coast. The children, moved separately in pairs over 2 weeks, were rerouted through occupied Denmark under new names, dressed in civilian rations and accompanied by SS handlers posing as aid workers. By April 16th, the extraction was complete. At 2:20, under heavy fog and complete radio silence, a Type IIC U-boat slipped away from a hidden inlet near Kristiansand, Norway. operating on a classified Kriegsmarine protocol known only to Himmler's inner staff. Aboard were 16 souls. No signal, no escort. They would not be seen again.